Emma Shortis, thank you for joining us. You've just written a piece in the conversation about Jimmy Kimmel's I guess I don't we'll call it a cancellation, but what we
Mm.
are seeing with a pattern here, preceded with Colbert, is that these giant parent companies are seeking to do business deals, and in order to do that, they need to be in the good books with this president, Donald Trump, and
Mm.
we are seeing capitulation.
It is wild, Dave. I think, even when you know what Trump is and what he's capable of, it's still shocking. And I think the speed at which it is occurring and the speed at which the capitulation is occurring is also quite shocking. And I think that was particularly true with Jimmy Kimmel because the timeline is so short. The chair of the FCC, Brendan Carr, who is a Project 2025 guy, like he's all in with the Trump movement, went on a right wing podcast and said that broadcasters who were showing Kimmel's show were running the risk of losing their licenses. And that night, like literally a couple of hours later, ABC's come out and said that they didn't say cancel. They said, I think the word they use is preempt or some silly language. Uh, the Carr show, Kimmel show indefinitely. So yeah, the timelines are incredibly short. It's so clear that the administration is, you know, enacting its plan for authoritarianism almost exactly as it said it would, in Project 2025. But that doesn't, again, it's not surprising, but that doesn't mean it's not shocking.
Especially liberal America that is still not, it's trying to find its ground. It's not positioning itself as, actual left anti-fascist opposition. It's trying to find this sort of middle ground, and it is living in this state of cognitive dissonance where it will comment on this incident in isolation from the Colbert
Mm.
incident and refusing to acknowledge the pattern, which is blatant authoritarian takeover of American democracy and media.
100%, and I think I mean, the Trump administration and the movement broadly is really good at making it so difficult to separate the signal from the noise, to sort of force you to focus on these moments one at a time in isolation rather than as a part of a whole pattern. But you're right, it's clearly a pattern. The Kimmel cancellation happens at the same time as the Australian Broadcasting Commission is banned from Trump's UK press conferences at the same time that Trump is now sending the National Guard into Memphis, at the same time that he's threatening to ban mail in voting. Like all of this is happening at once. And you're right that, liberal America is, I think, caught up in this singular incidents or even a kind of politics that like predates Biden, even,
Hmm.
to have the darling of the New York Times, Ezra Klein, running around, talking about how Charlie Kirk was a champion of free speech. And the problem is here that, liberals and the left aren't willing to debate their political opponents. Like that is, it's, I mean, you could call it naive, but I think it's bordering on dangerous because it's such a dramatic misunderstanding of the political reality of the US today.
It's also a misunderstanding of the value of debate against fascists. I mean, what we're gonna op-ed our way out of this? I can't see that being viable.
But I mean, that is still the mindset, isn't it, of liberal and, centrist America that like if we just put the words in the right order, if we
Yeah.
just explain the facts to them in the right way, then they'll understand and they'll realize that racism is bad and they shouldn't do it.
Yes, it's asking an awful lot of reason and empathy from people that are showing themselves to be tyrants, which would
Mm,
be, again, it's just cognitively dissonant. What are we seeing on the
mm.
streets of Los Angeles and Chicago, etc.?
Yeah, so I mean, of course, this started with Los Angeles, where Trump deployed the National Guard against the wishes of the governor and the state leadership, which is brazenly unconstitutional. Though we know he doesn't care about that, and that was always a test run. And I think they were open about the fact that that was a test run. Trump, of course, then sent the National Guard into DC. And when they announced that, he listed off the cities that were next. He talked about Chicago, he talked about Baltimore, um, And now they're sending them into Memphis, Tennessee, which I think is a little bit jarring because Tennessee, of course, is a Republican state, but Memphis is a Democrat-run city, as Trump would say. So this is, I think this is part of that broader picture where Trump is using the agencies of law enforcement and the military to sow fear and suppress dissent and extend that chilling effect that is already occurring in the United States. And it's also, of course, to implement his program of mass deportations, which again is denying people their constitutional rights, again, which he doesn't care about. And I think this is all really a test run for the further deployment of the National Guard. And I think the intersection of that and the midterm elections in particular is really, really something to watch.
How effective is this chilling, stifling climate of fear that the
Mm.
administration is trying to push into people that are willing to dissent?
Yeah. Look, I think it's difficult to tell that at the moment. I think that there is clearly a chilling effect going on. Of course, there is. That's the point. But we are still seeing really significant grassroots resistance on the streets, to particularly to deportations by immigrations and customs enforcement by ICE agents, where you have and you'll see videos of this on social media all the time, particularly elected representatives using the power that they have to resist arrests, to resist incursions by ICE agents into places like elementary schools and people's homes. Like, it's horrific, but people are afraid, and I think rightly afraid, and that will inevitably have a chilling effect. But it's not inevitable that it works in that linear way. I think that there is resistance, and further oppression will engender more resistance and more dissent in some sectors, and it may be uneven. But it is a genuinely really dangerous situation, I think, when you have a president who is you know, openly talking about retribution against, really like anybody who he defines as his enemy. And that's a pretty broad group of people.
It is, and I've noticed that they're doing a trick that they did in the early 2000s with the war on terror, declaring a war on a nebulous concept, and
Mm,
they're talking about criminalizing Antifa, which isn't a collective group that has a membership name. It's basically an adherence to an idea that we are going to resist state corporate fascism and fight back. And
mm.
by allocating an idea as a terrorist organization, that is potentially incredibly dangerous because you could basically declare anyone a terrorist that adheres to these
Yeah,
sorts of beliefs.
yep, absolutely. And I mean, Stephen Miller effectively said as much, that that's the plan. Networks and organizations loosely defined that they will often describe as the radical left or Antifa, but the point is that those are nebulous terms and they can mean whatever they want them to mean. Often when Miller and Vance and those types talk about the quote unquote radical left, what they mean is the Democratic Party. Which is, neither radical nor arguably left. But that's how they define it. And you're right that it gives them, using the label of domestic terrorism gives them huge scope for repression. And they have those agencies, they have the Department of Homeland Security um, that can enable them to do that. And that's where the kind of longer threads of American history, the war on terror in particular, um, have enabled the rise of fascism in the United States.
Prior to the last German election, prior to World War II, Nazi leadership held a meeting with corporate leaders in the German economy. They were titans of mining, finance, textiles, and he basically said to them, with less democracy, you will make more profit. Please finance my campaign. Get on board. And then that happened. You have the merger of state corporate power, and they ended up winning what became the last election. There's so many patterns and parallels and rhymes
Mm.
with this. We keep constantly seeing Silicon Valley tech bros brought into the White House to give gifts and kiss his feet. And it is I mean, it's gross and it's depraved, but it is also the exact same thing that happened prior to the Nazi regime taking off.
Mm. Yeah, Dave, I'm a historian by training, so I'm kind of my training makes me really reluctant to do those like direct comparisons. But it is like frighteningly easy to do. Like the parallels are shocking. And I think we shouldn't necessarily get too caught up in that because Trump's brand of fascism is a particularly American brand of fascism that has particularly American roots. But the parallels are there. They're undeniable. Which I guess makes it all the more frightening. But I think you're right about the alliance between corporate America, the 1% and Trump is clear. It was clear from his inauguration when they were all sitting, ahead of members of Trump's cabinet. Like the power dynamics there were clear. And those Titans signaled their intent really clearly. Bezos signaled it really clearly with the Washington Post that their interests lie in their own enrichment. And some of them are quite clearly deeply ideologically aligned with Trump and are using him to implement that ideological agenda. Peter Thiel is the obvious example.
He's a terrifying individual, that man. I want to move on from the Nazi
Yeah, sure.
comparison. You're right, because I'm caught up on the alligator Alcatraz thing and the fact that
Hmm.
they merchandised it. Because you're right, that is particularly American. That's, so American. It's unique. The Germans probably had a little bit, I don't know, thought better of that.
I don't think the comparison is um, a bad one or an unrigorous one. I think it's just understanding the threads of American history that got us here is really important to understanding Trump's rise and how he's able to use the levers of power in that particularly American way and build
Hmm.
that particularly like American aesthetic that you identified, the Trump branding and the weird, AI images of him as like a superhero and the emblazoning the Oval Office with gold. Like it's a particular aesthetic that Trump has created that is, I think, fits very well into our understanding of fascism as an ideological movement. Trump has been better at that in the United States than almost anyone else. I think actually anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, well, the credit where it's due, far out. Um,
Thank you.
to people like you and I, and I suppose the viewers of this show, these patterns are discernible and obvious and rub up against
Mm.
whatever morality or political ideologies we already have, and we think this is abhorrent and we don't like it because, this is every single story we've ever told since we were a child. But there is a vast chunk of people that either can't see it or are in favor of it. Who are these people? Why are they like this?
What a question, Dave. I don't necessarily think it's a big chunk of people. Like we've done polling at the Australia Institute, and it's fairly clear that the Australian community is like deeply concerned about what is happening in the United States and can see it for what it is. When we asked, and this was like a few months ago when we asked about whether Australians would prefer a closer alliance with the United States or a more independent foreign policy, 54% chose a more independent foreign policy. And like that's a pretty significant shift if we consider, the history of our alliance. So I think in that sense, community sentiment is really quite far ahead of our leadership.
Mhm.
And that's who can't see. I think that's who you're getting at, who seem almost constitutionally unable to see what is happening. And I think there are a few things going on there. The probably the main one is that the sort of architecture of Australian foreign policy and Australian security policy has for 75 years been oriented entirely towards the US alliance. The assumptions about America making us safer, America being our greatest protector, are so deeply ingrained in that kind of bureaucratic culture that it's apparently almost impossible to see. And examining that or questioning that is not just a question of kind of analysis or observation, but becomes a an almost existential question that all of the assumptions that you have based, you know, 75 years of policy on are wrong. Like that's a
Hmm.
big, apparently it's a really big step to make. And, turning that ship around, I think is really difficult. So I think there's that, like that's the broad picture I would draw. I think there are also, for whatever reason, in the cabinet of the current government, those who are clearly all in with the alliance, even in the face of directly observable evidence about the state of the United States, I'm thinking particularly of the defense minister,
Hmm.
have clearly won the argument. Like, have clearly won the argument about the AUKUS submarine pact in particular. And, that is taking precedence over everything, like rescuing that for, potentially pragmatic political reasons. Maybe the mindset is still that old one that, Labor can't win on national security. And so they have to be, stronger, as strong as, if not stronger than the coalition on that
I mean,
issue.
they don't have
But
an opposition. Like,
yeah, absolutely. And I think again that clearly that mindset has not yet shifted, and it hasn't shifted in the mainstream media either.
no.
Where there's this like assumption that they have to ask the Liberals for permission to change national security policy when they're, the Liberals are irrelevant and potentially will be not just for this term of government but for several terms. And I think that will catch up with the government. I think that that community pressure that I mentioned is only going to grow as Trump continues to be Trump. We can see uh, internal issues in the Labor Party already at the grassroots. The Victorian State Labor Conference passed a motion calling for the suspension of AUKUS and for a parliamentary inquiry. The National Conference is next year. I suspect the same kind of issues will come up. Like, imagine what will happen between now and the National Conference. Like, we're only 8 months into the Trump
I don't
administration.
want to imagine, Emma.
No, no, fair. Neither do I. Um, so I do think that the ground is shifting and will likely force the government to move in some way if they're brave enough to do it. And that, I mean, that's still a big if.
Yeah, they haven't shown much bravery thus far. Across the Western world, this touches on the point you're making, especially in relation to the massive demonstrations against the genocide in Israel.
Mm,
We are seeing Western governments in a bipartisan fashion, with their oppositions aligned against the public will, and it doesn't, and with like massively,
yeah, yeah.
sentiment is 75% wants Israel to stop doing the horrific things they're doing. And we cannot get our governments to pay attention to us. This feels like a crisis of Western democracy, not just a crisis of American democracy.
I think that's absolutely true, Dave, and it's been a long time coming. And I think, you're so right to identify that level of protest and the unwillingness of democracies to respond. And I think also the way in which the suppression of uh, protest against the genocide was in many ways a test run for broader suppression. In the UK, in the United States as well, where arbitrary deportations, detentions, and deportation were first done against international students protesting the genocide. That was clearly a test run, and I think others have pointed that out and are right to. It, I think it feels too slow and of course is inadequate, but I do think things are shifting. I think the government has shifted, of course, too late and not enough, but it is responding to that significant community pressure. In this week at the UNGA, Australia will finally recognise Palestinian statehood. And I think some important lessons to draw from that is that Australia can take a different path than the United States, and can manage the potential consequences of that quite successfully, and also use the respect that we do have internationally, to make change. That Australia is doing that and finally joining the 148 other
Yep.
countries that recognize Palestinian statehood
Hmm.
is not nothing. Like it's not enough, but it is, I think, regarded as significant that Australia, the arguably staunchest ally of the United States, is taking this step in direct contravention of the wishes of the United States. Again, like not enough, and when that kind of language is not backed up by actual
Mm.
action and actual consequences, like clearly it isn't enough. But I mean, maybe it's just like searching for hope in the dark. But I do think that things, I think things are shifting. And, the question is whether the Australian government in particular keeps up.
I hope so. I hope so. I was speaking to a Bianca Webb Pullman who is from my suburb, and she's currently on the flotilla to Gaza. And her, this is the sign of the decay in our democracy. Her local member, Josh Burns, is, a staunch Zionist, as far as I can tell,
Mm.
putting Greater Israel's interest above the safety of one of his own constituents on his way to feed starving children. So I'm not finding a ton of hope in this
Yeah,
particular government. It
not at
seems
all.
completely infiltrated by people that are working against better interest of humanity, as far as I can tell. But
Yeah,
yeah,
look, I mean, I think it's worth saying that, the Australian government has talked up the international rules-based order for a long time, and that that rules-based order, which of course is uneven and largely created to benefit the United States, still benefited Australia. It has contributed to our security, and for the Australian government to still talk about that in the face of our alliance with the United States, in the face of the clear and deliberate dismantling of international law by Israel, by the United States, by Russia, all acting in concert with each other, is is pretty hard to take. Hypocrisy is not strong enough a word. But again, I do think that something will give in the Labor Party. Again, too late and too slow, but I think it will.
I mean, other nations are starting to set that path. Spain has announced that it's not
Mm.
going to trade at all with Israel, and it's sanctioning, and it's also demanding safety for its citizens that are on the flotilla to Gaza. Do you think Australia will ever manage to take those necessary steps?
I mean, I think it's entirely possible that Australia does. We have, as a nation, stood up for the principles of international law many times in the past, and have a proud history of significant contribution to peace building efforts. And I think that's what's being lost. Like and I'm guilty of this as well. Like we talk a lot about diplomacy and less about peace building. That if you want peace, you prepare for peace, and that's not the mindset apparently of the current government. It's certainly not the mindset of the Trump administration. But there's no reason that can't change. Australia's the 12th biggest economy in the world. We're like roughly the size of Russia, and we don't act like we have that much power or that much agency. But that can change. And again, I think there is a growing community call for Australia to do more and be more principled on the international stage. So, I'll be watching Australia at the UN carefully. Again, same as you, I don't have a huge amount of hope, but the possibility for change is never precluded.
Absolutely. How do you think our media is faring here? Our mainstream media is faring here comparatively to American mainstream media.
Well, I mean, the John Lyons moment was pretty felt like an important moment in that sense. An Australian, a highly respected Australian journalist who um, is, head and shoulders above many of the rest in the mainstream, especially for his coverage of Israel and Palestine, I think. Asking perfectly legitimate questions about the president of the United States business interests being shut down like that. Again, shocking, but not surprising. And then to have the ABC effectively banned from President Trump's press conference in the UK in clear retaliation. I think that's a proud moment for journalism in Australia, but it's not necessarily backed up by much of the coverage from the rest of the mainstream media of the administration itself. I think there's much like that kind of bureaucratic inertia I was talking about. I think much of the mainstream media has really struggled to understand what is happening or to see what is happening in the United States for what it is. And some of that I think is just learned culture. In order to become a senior journalist in a mainstream organization in Australia, like you generally have to have been a US correspondent.
Hmm.
And, that involves seeing a lot of the glory of American power. For a lot of that generation, it has meant like going to President Obama's inauguration
Yeah.
and being, I think, understandably, like overawed by American power and what American democracy can be when it is at its best and when it is viewed from a highly privileged position. And I think those assumptions are deeply ingrained. And that's facilitated by a foreign policy apparatus, like think tanks in particular, that are entirely oriented towards the alliance, often, funded directly by the US State Department or US weapons manufacturers. So we have this kind of ecosystem that's not oriented to identifying what is
Hmm.
happening in the United States. And you know better than I that that extends to Australian mainstream coverage of Israel as well. So I don't think, broadly speaking, the Australian public has been well served by the mainstream media in that sense. But I mean, you asked about US media, nor has uh, the American public. I think probably at a larger scale where we're seeing this preemptive, I think,
Mm.
capitulation to Trump's threats. He threatened. He was on Air Force One just today as we're recording, threatening the View, like
What?
like
That's
yeah,
the
threatening to
really?
exactly.
I
That's
mean,
right where it
between
went.
Kimmel and The View, you can't think of much more mainstream, sort of safe commentary. Like, they're not exactly the shot.
No, not quite.
Far out. Jesus, it's grim. I suppose not having. I mean, the other thing is there's also this just giant monolith of American cultural propaganda that we've all absorbed forever. Just growing up, watching Arnold Schwarzenegger kill Arabs with nukes over and over and over
Mm.
again. Like that's a huge part of this stuff that we don't really examine, and then we end up with a powerful person taking us on a junket to see some amazing building and instill these amazing values in us, and then that shapes your coverage for the next 25 years without you ever questioning whether any of that was
Mm.
bullshit.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that's largely true. It's so easy to get sucked into the mythology of American democracy and American exceptionalism, and that like goes a long way to explaining Australia's position on the alliance. I think for the last 75 years, but I think it's also true that like that a lot of that overshadows the some of the genuine connections that we have with America at its best. Like, we'll often talk about the alliance as based on shared democratic values, and that's like obviously not true anymore if it ever was. But that doesn't mean that like we don't have those people to people contacts and those like organizational contacts or cultural contacts that like really do mean something and can bring out the good things in both of our politics when they're lifted up and when they're allowed to. And I think a lot of the polling we're seeing out in Australia around feelings towards the United States and what Trump is doing is driven by not necessarily like a rejection of our relationship with the United States, but by like genuine concern for what is happening to Americans. I think that's what drives like your concern as well, and my concern and deep fear is that you know, we do have an attachment to parts of the United States, and seeing what is happening is genuinely devastating. But I
Yeah.
think that's the pathway forward. Like that's where the core of the relationship should be, in those shared democratic and cultural values, and in an honest examination of the damage that some of those shared connections have done historically. But that's, probably a more complicated conversation than we're able to have in the current media environment.
I mean, that's right. We're asking for some self-examination and some truth
Mm,
from people that are quite clearly not capable of those things, nor interested in those things. But
yeah.
it is the path forward. I think you're entirely correct. And that's the tragedy of this moment, isn't obviously I exude antipathy to American empire. Like that's my politics, but that doesn't
Yeah.
mean I don't have Americans that I love and want to be safe and live free lives and not end up in fucking El Salvador for saying free Palestine. Like this is a tragedy.
Yeah. It's a total tragedy. And I think, the fact that our conversations about foreign policy in America, in Australia, are framed in such simplistic binaries,
Mm.
you know, that either we're all in with the United States, we're all in with Trump, no matter what he does, or like the very next day, we're living under Chinese communist dictatorship. Like that's the framing
Yeah.
of like the Nine Papers, for example, like quite
Hmm.
brazenly. And that's just not true. And it does such a disservice, I think, to people's ability to see the complexity of this situation and to have compassion. You know, I don't think anybody serious is really advocating for abandoning our relationship with America. I think they're advocating for a dramatic rethink of our security and of the capital A alliance. But I don't think anybody serious is advocating for a total abandonment of that history or those shared values. You know, I think Australians recognize that we have an interest in the survival of American democracy. Like it's not in anyone's interests that American democracy fails.
I think we should probably leave it there. I don't think we're going to get a better ending than that.
Thanks so much, Dave.